December 1943, a cold night in occupied Poland. Inside the barbed wire fences of Auschwitz, a British prisoner of war makes an impossible decision. While thousands pray to escape this nightmare, Charles Coward is about to do the opposite. He's going to break in. Not to the comfortable compound where Allied POWs are held. No, to the Jewish sector. To the place where people are worked to death on empty stomachs. Where the smokestacks never stop burning. Where tomorrow is never guaranteed. He switches clothes with a concentration camp inmate, steps through an invisible line that separates the living from the condemned, and spends one night witnessing what the Nazis desperately wanted the world never to see. This is just one night in an extraordinary war. But to understand how a British soldier ended up voluntarily entering hell, we need to go back to where it all began. To an ordinary man who would become anything but ordinary. A man whose name was Coward, but whose actions defined courage. There's nothing in Charles Coward's early years that screams hero. Born January 30th, 1905 in Edmonton, North London. Working class. Loved football, particularly Tottenham Hotspur. Worked at Harris Liebus Furniture Factory as a timber porter. The kind of man you'd pass on the street without a second glance. But in June 1937, at 32 years old, Coward did something unexpected. He enlisted in the British Army. Not because war had started. Britain was still at peace. Hitler was consolidating power in Germany, but most Britons hoped it wouldn't come to conflict. Coward simply felt drawn to serve. By 1939, when Germany invaded Poland and Britain declared war, Coward held the rank of Battery Quartermaster Sergeant Major in the 8th Reserve Regimental Royal Artillery. A logistics man. Someone who managed supplies, coordinated equipment, kept the machinery of war running smoothly. And he had one crucial skill that would define everything to come. Charles Coward spoke fluent German. May 10th, 1940. Germany launches Case Yellow, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. Coward's unit, part of the British Expeditionary Force, rushes to defensive positions. The plan seems solid. The Maginot Line fortifications, French forces, British reinforcements. Surely they can hold. They can't. The German blitzkrieg doesn't attack where expected. Panzer divisions punch through the Ardennes forest, a route the French considered impassable for tanks. Dive bombers scream overhead. Radio communications collapse. Command structures fracture. Within days, what seemed like a defensive stalemate becomes a catastrophic rout. By late May, the British and French are in full retreat toward the coast. The port of Dunkirk becomes humanity's last hope. Over 8 days, an armada of destroyers, fishing boats, pleasure yachts, anything that floats crosses the English Channel. They evacuate over 338,000 soldiers. Churchill calls it a miracle, but miracles don't reach everyone. On May 21st, 1940, German forces assault Calais. While Dunkirk's evacuation proceeds just 30 miles north, Coward's unit fights a desperate holding action. They're buying time with their lives, building by building, street by street. The fighting is savage. May 25th, the ammunition runs out. The food runs out. The options run out. Charles Coward, along with his remaining comrades, surrenders to German forces. He's 35 years old. He's now a prisoner of war. And for most men, that would be the end of the story. Sit out the war, survive, wait for liberation. But Charles Coward never got that particular memo. Here's what's supposed to happen when you're captured. You give your name, rank, and serial number as required by the Geneva Convention. You march to whatever prison camp they assign you. You follow orders. You keep your head down. You count the days until it's over. Charles Coward had different plans. Before he even reached his first official POW camp, he escaped. Twice, used his German language skills to blend in, posed as a wounded German soldier, tried to disappear into the chaos of occupied France. Both times, he was recaptured before he could reach neutral territory or Allied lines. But here's what matters: he tried. The Germans moved him from camp to camp. Each time they thought they'd found somewhere secure enough to hold this troublesome Englishman. Each time, Coward proved them wrong. His third escape attempt was the most audacious yet. During a transfer, he slipped away again, this time managing to reach a German military field hospital. His plan was simple and insane. Pretend to be a wounded German soldier, get medical treatment, blend in, disappear. He wrapped himself in bandages. He spoke perfect German. He groaned in pain convincingly. The German doctors treated him with care, believing he was one of their own. Other wounded soldiers lay beside him, sharing stories of battles, of home, of hope the war would end soon. And then something extraordinary happened. A German commandant entered the hospital ward. He walked between the beds, pinning medals on wounded soldiers. The Iron Cross, Germany's highest military honor for bravery in combat. When he reached Coward's bed, he pinned the Iron Cross to his hospital gown and offered words of gratitude for his service to the fatherland. Charles Coward, British prisoner of war, serial troublemaker, had just been awarded Nazi Germany's highest military decoration. The deception didn't last. Someone eventually discovered the truth. Coward was sent back to captivity, this time with a reputation. The Germans now knew exactly who they were dealing with. A man who wouldn't stop, who wouldn't quit, who turned capture into a challenge rather than a defeat. Between 1940 and 1943, Coward attempted to escape 7 more times. 7. Each time, he was recaptured. Each time, the Germans moved him to supposedly more secure facilities, and each time, when he wasn't actively escaping, he was causing problems, sabotaging work details, organizing other prisoners, making himself as difficult to manage as humanly possible. The German guards began calling him something, not an official designation, just a nickname that spread from camp to camp: Charlie the Champion, the English prisoner who never stopped fighting. By late 1943, the Germans had had enough. They needed a solution for Charles Coward. Somewhere so secure, so well guarded, so utterly inescapable that even this madman couldn't cause trouble. They decided to send him to Poland, to a sprawling complex of labor camps that supported a massive industrial facility. The camp was called Auschwitz. The Germans thought they were solving a problem. They had no idea they'd just put Charles Coward exactly where he could do the most damage. December 1943. The train carrying British POWs pulls into the Auschwitz complex. Charles Coward steps onto the platform and into a world of contradictions. He's not being sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau, the extermination camp. Not to Auschwitz I, the original concentration camp. He's assigned to Auschwitz III, also called Monowitz, a labor camp, a place where prisoners work rather than die immediately, though the distinction often proves temporary. Monowitz serves the IG Farben Corporation, one of Germany's largest chemical and pharmaceutical companies. They're building a massive facility to produce synthetic rubber and liquid fuel. Buna, they call it. The project requires tens of thousands of laborers, slave laborers. Coward and approximately 1,200 to 1,400 other British POWs are housed in Subcamp E-715. They're the skilled workers, the ones who'll run the technical aspects of the facility. As Allied prisoners of war, they're theoretically protected by the Geneva Convention. They receive Red Cross packages. They sleep in barrack buildings with heat. They get sufficient food to survive. Just a few hundred yards away, 10,000 Jewish prisoners live under completely different conditions. 6, 8, sometimes 10 men crammed into bunks designed for one. Watery soup that barely qualifies as food, 12-hour work shifts, beatings for moving too slowly, shootings for arbitrary reasons, and when someone becomes too weak to work, they disappear. Everyone knows where: to Birkenau, to the gas chambers, to the crematoria that paint the sky with ash. Two worlds, separated by a fence, connected by unimaginable cruelty. And Charles Coward is about to step between them. The German authorities need someone to serve as liaison between the British POWs and the camp administration. Someone who speaks German. Someone who can communicate effectively. Someone organized enough to manage the distribution of Red Cross supplies. They choose Charles Coward. They have no idea they've just handed him exactly the position he needs. As Red Cross trustee for the British prisoners, Coward suddenly has privileges other POWs don't. He can move somewhat freely within the camp. He can travel to nearby towns to purchase supplies for the British contingent. He can send and receive mail more easily. He has access to Red Cross packages filled with chocolate, cigarettes, soap, tinned food. And Charles Coward is going to weaponize every single one of these privileges. His first realization comes quickly. The British prisoners receive far more food than they need. Not luxurious, but adequate, enough to survive, even to maintain reasonable health. Meanwhile, the Jewish prisoners are being systematically starved, deliberately, calculated cruelty designed to work them to death before the cost of feeding them becomes inconvenient. Coward begins organizing the British POWs. They set aside portions of their rations, share their Red Cross packages. Not all of them, they need to maintain their own health, but enough. And Coward, with his freedom of movement, smuggles this food to the Jewish prisoners working alongside them at the construction site. A piece of bread, a bit of chocolate, a tin of meat. These aren't grand gestures, they don't save everyone, but they keep some people alive a little longer. And sometimes, a little longer is the difference between death and liberation. But food is just the beginning. Coward's position allows him to travel into the nearby town of Oświęcim, the Polish name for Auschwitz. He needs to maintain the pretense of his role, purchase razor blades, soap, supplies for the British prisoners, but these trips serve another purpose. He watches, he learns, he documents. The trainloads of people arriving, families stepping onto the platform with their suitcases, believing they're being resettled for work. The selections. The immediate separation of those deemed fit for labour from those sent directly to the gas chambers. Children, elderly, the sick, all condemned within minutes of arrival. The townsfolk know, everyone knows. They see the trains, they smell the smoke, they hear the whispered stories. Coward talks to civilians, to guards, to other prisoners. Everyone tells the same story. Thousands upon thousands are being murdered, gassed, cremated, their ashes scattered or dumped into nearby rivers. Coward begins writing letters, not to family, to a mysterious Mr. Orange, friendly, casual letters about nothing important. Weather, camp conditions, trivial observations. Except Mr. Orange doesn't exist, it's a code name. The letters go to the British War Office, and buried in the mundane observations are details, numbers, locations, descriptions. The British authorities receive intelligence about Auschwitz from a man inside the camp, hard, specific, eyewitness information about the Holocaust as it's happening. When representatives from the Swiss Red Cross visit the camp in summer 1944, Coward finds opportunities to speak with them, always carefully, always aware he's being watched. But he makes sure they hear about the gas chambers in Birkenau, about the crematory working day and night, about the systematic murder of human beings on an industrial scale. Most of these reports are dismissed or ignored. It's too big, too impossible, too much for people safe in Switzerland or London to truly believe. But the information is out there. Someone is trying to tell the world. Then comes the note. It's smuggled to Coward through channels he's established with the underground prisoner network. A message from Dr. Karel Sperber, a British Royal Navy ship's doctor. Except Sperber isn't in the British POW section. He's Jewish. And the Germans don't care about his commission or his nationality. He's been sent to the Jewish section of Monowitz. Coward knows what this means. Sperber won't last long under those conditions. The doctor is probably already weakening. Time is running out. Coward decides he needs to find him, to see if he can help, to do something. But there's a problem. Coward can't just walk into the Jewish section. The separation is absolute. The guards watch. The consequences for being caught would be severe. So Coward develops a plan that's either brilliant or suicidal, possibly both. During a work detail, he approaches an inmate, proposes a swap. The inmate will wear Coward's British POW clothes and return to the British compound with the other POWs. Coward will wear the inmate's striped prisoner uniform and march back to the Jewish barracks. The inmate, understandably, thinks Coward is insane. Why would anyone voluntarily enter that hell? But eventually, arrangements are made. Contacts in the prisoner underground agree to facilitate the swap. 2 other inmates will vouch for Coward, claim he's been there all along, help him avoid immediate detection. As evening falls, and the work details prepare to march back to their respective camps, Charles Coward strips off his British uniform and puts on the striped rags of a concentration camp prisoner. He lines up with the Jewish workers. Guards count heads. The numbers match. The column begins its march, and Charles Coward walks voluntarily into Auschwitz proper. The barracks are worse than Coward imagined. Multiple prisoners crammed into wooden bunks stacked 3 high. The smell of unwashed bodies, disease, death. Men who are little more than walking skeletons. Eyes that have seen too much. Coward's 2 contacts immediately take him to a bunk. They lie down on either side of him, effectively hiding him between them. They whisper urgent instructions. Don't talk to anyone else. Don't make eye contact with guards. Don't move around. Just survive until morning. The night stretches endlessly. Coward can hear everything. Coughs, groans, quiet sobbing. Someone praying in Yiddish. The guards walking outside. The ever-present smell from the crematoria at Birkenau, just a few miles away. He doesn't find Dr. Sperber. 10,000 prisoners. No way to search without drawing fatal attention. But he sees everything he needs to see. The conditions, the casual brutality. The systematic destruction of human dignity. This isn't a labor camp. It's death in slow motion. When morning comes, Coward reverses the process, swaps clothes again during a work detail, returns to the British section. No one in authority ever discovers what happened, but Charles Coward now has something more valuable than second-hand reports. He has eyewitness testimony. He was there. He saw it. He can testify to it. And after the war, he will, at Nuremberg. His testimony will help convict IG Farben executives of crimes against humanity. But that's years away. Right now, in late 1943 and into 1944, Charles Coward has another mission. He's going to save as many people as he can. The system Coward develops is simple, brilliant, and extraordinarily risky. Here's how it works. British POWs receive Red Cross packages containing luxuries that have enormous value in the camp economy. Chocolate, especially. The SS guards love chocolate. They're willing to trade for it. What can you trade for chocolate in a death camp? Coward discovers you can trade for bodies, or more specifically, for the paperwork and clothing of dead prisoners. Non-Jewish prisoners, Belgian forced laborers, French civilians, Polish political prisoners, people who died from disease or malnutrition, but whose deaths are processed through normal channels with documentation. Coward bribes SS guards with chocolate, cigarettes, soap, sometimes just friendly conversation, because even guards get lonely, and Coward speaks fluent German. In exchange, he receives the identification papers and clothing of dead prisoners. The guards assume he wants souvenirs, evidence to prove he was here. They don't ask too many questions. The chocolate is too good. But Coward doesn't want souvenirs. He wants escape routes. Working with contacts in the Polish resistance and the prisoner underground, Coward identifies Jewish prisoners who have a chance, people who are still healthy enough to walk, who haven't been broken by the camps yet, who have the mental fortitude to attempt escape. The plan requires precise coordination. During the evening march back from the work site to the camp, at a specific location, a Jewish prisoner drops out of the column, hides in a ditch beside the road. In that ditch, Coward has previously placed the clothing and papers of a dead, non-Jewish prisoner. When the column is counted back at camp, the numbers don't match. Guards search. They find a body in civilian clothes, dead from disease or exhaustion, they assume. Just another casualty. They process the paperwork. The numbers now balance. Except the body isn't the person who escaped. It's one of the corpses Coward obtained. And the Jewish prisoner who died is now hiding in the ditch, wearing new clothes, carrying new papers, with a new identity. Members of the Polish resistance meet these escapees, provide safe houses, help them move through occupied Poland toward relative safety. Some reach neutral countries, some join partisan groups, some simply disappear into new identities. How many? The exact number is debated. Coward claimed 400. Some historians are skeptical, suggesting it might have been fewer. The problem is, no records exist. That was the point. These people needed to vanish completely. New names, new identities, no paper trail. But even if it was 50, even if it was 20, even if it was 10, Charles Coward pulled off one of the most extraordinary rescue operations of the Holocaust, right under the noses of the SS, using nothing but chocolate, courage, and creativity. January 1945. The Soviet Red Army is advancing through Poland. The Germans know Auschwitz will fall soon. They begin destroying evidence, burning documents, demolishing gas chambers, killing prisoners who could testify. On January 17, 1945, the SS orders the evacuation of Auschwitz. Thousands of prisoners are forced on death marches westward. Those too weak to walk are shot. Those who fall behind are shot. The cold is brutal. Snow covers everything. People die by the hundreds every day. Charles Coward and the other British POWs are included in this forced march. But as Allied prisoners of war, they're in better condition than the concentration camp inmates. Better fed, better clothed, better able to survive the journey. The march continues for weeks, across Poland, into Germany, toward Bavaria. Guards shoot stragglers. Prisoners drop from exhaustion. The war is clearly ending, but the dying continues. In late April 1945, somewhere in Bavaria, the columns of prisoners encounter American forces. The Germans, seeing the situation is hopeless, surrender. The war in Europe has days left. Charles Coward is free, after 5 years as a prisoner of war, after Auschwitz, after the death march. He's alive. But the story isn't over. In fact, it's about to become very public. November 1945. The Nuremberg Trials begin. The world is finally ready to hear the truth about the Holocaust, about the camps, about the systematic murder of 6 million Jews and millions of others. The trials proceed in stages. The major Nazi leaders first, Goering, Ribbentrop, Keitel. Then subsequent trials for different groups, medical personnel, judges, industrialists. In 1947, the IG Farben trial begins. 24 executives and directors of the chemical corporation are charged with slavery, mass murder, and crimes against humanity. The prosecution needs to prove that IG Farben knowingly used slave labor from Auschwitz, that they worked prisoners to death, that they were complicit in genocide for profit. They need witnesses, people who were there, who saw what happened, who can testify to the conditions at Monowitz and the broader Auschwitz complex. Charles Coward takes the stand. His testimony is devastating. He describes the working conditions at the Buna plant, the exhaustion, the malnutrition, the casual violence. He explains how prisoners were worked until they collapsed, then replaced with fresh victims from new transports. He details the gas chambers at Birkenau, the selections, the crematoria. But what makes his testimony unique is this: Coward isn't speaking secondhand. He's not relaying rumors or reports. He spent the night inside the camp. He saw it himself. He has answers to questions other witnesses can't address: details, locations, the systematic nature of the killing. The defense attorneys try to undermine him, question his motives, suggest he's exaggerating. But Coward is unshakable. He speaks calmly, factually, without obvious emotion or embellishment. He's a British NCO giving a report. Clear, precise, impossible to dismiss. His testimony helps convict several IG Farben executives. The sentences aren't long enough. Most serve less than 5 years. IG Farben itself survives the war, eventually being split into companies that still exist today: BASF, Bayer, Agfa, Sanofi. Justice is incomplete and unsatisfying. But Charles Coward ensured that what happened at Auschwitz was documented in an official international court. His testimony became part of the permanent historical record. Deniers can't erase it. Revisionists can't rewrite it. The truth is there, in court transcripts, in his own words. After the trials, Coward returns to England, to Edmonton, London, to 133 Chichester Road, where he'll live until his death. He goes back to ordinary life, back to the furniture factory. When that closes in 1969, he takes a job as a dispatch clerk at an Oxford Street department store. He marries, has a quiet life, supports Tottenham Hotspur on weekends, joins the Freemasons in 1955, becoming a member of the Camberwell Old Comrades Lodge. His fellow Masons remember him as modest, self-effacing, not someone who bragged about his wartime exploits. But his story doesn't stay quiet. In 1954, John Castle publishes The Password is Courage, a biography of Coward's wartime experiences. The book becomes a sensation. It's been through 10 editions, still in print today. In 1962, Hollywood adapts the book into a film. Dirk Bogarde plays Charles Coward. The movie is light-hearted, almost comedic. It focuses on his escape attempts, his schemes, his cat-and-mouse games with German guards. It barely mentions Auschwitz, barely acknowledges the Jewish prisoners he saved. It turns his story into an adventure tale, entertainment. Coward served as technical advisor on the film. He even appears in a brief cameo, but the movie isn't really about what mattered most. It's about what plays well on screen. The escapes, the Iron Cross, the clever tricks, not the chocolate bribes. not the night in the barracks, not the bodies in ditches. In 1960, before the movie is released, Coward appears on the BBC television show This Is Your Life. It's a popular program where a celebrity is surprised on air and their life story is told through visits from old friends and colleagues. For Coward's episode, they bring out fellow prisoners, his wife, people from the community. And at the end, they bring out Norbert Wollheim, a former Auschwitz inmate. A man who lost his wife and 3-year-old son in the gas chambers. A man whose life might have ended without people like Coward. The two men meet on camera, shake hands. Wollheim thanks him. Coward, characteristically, downplays his role, says he only did what anyone would have done. Which is, of course, not true. Most people didn't do what Charles Coward did. Most people couldn't. In 1963, Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial and Museum in Israel, names Charles Coward as righteous among the nations. It's one of the highest honors Israel can bestow on a non-Jew, reserved for those who risked their lives to save Jews during the Holocaust. A tree is planted in his honor in the Avenue of the Righteous at Yad Vashem. His name is inscribed on the Wall of Honor. He's the first British person to receive this recognition. He won't be the last, but he's the first. The ceremony is quiet. Coward doesn't make a big deal of it. He travels to Israel, accepts the honor with characteristic humility, and returns to his quiet life in London. In 2003, English Heritage erects a blue plaque at his home in Edmonton. It reads, "Charles Coward, soldier, saved Jews from Auschwitz. The North Middlesex Hospital names a ward after him." In 2010, 4 years after his death in 1976, the British government posthumously names him a British hero of the Holocaust. But here's what's interesting. After his death, historians began questioning some of his claims, not the major facts, not his presence at Auschwitz or his testimony at Nuremberg, but the numbers, the scale of his rescue operations. Did he really save 400 people, or was it fewer? When Yad Vashem researchers questioned him in 1962, he offered few details about the identities or fates of the people he helped. He said he didn't know exactly how many regained freedom because they went different ways to different countries. No records were kept because that was the point. These people needed new identities, new papers, new names. Some historians are skeptical, suggest the number might have been smaller, tens, rather than hundreds. The problem is, there's no way to know. The very secrecy that made the operation possible prevents us from counting its success. Does it matter? If it was 50 instead of 400, is Charles Coward less of a hero? If it was 20? If it was 10? He still entered Auschwitz voluntarily, still testified at Nuremberg, still risked his life repeatedly for people he had no obligation to help. The exact number doesn't change what he represents. One man, without resources, without authority, without power, who decided that doing nothing wasn't acceptable. One man who saw evil and decided to fight it in whatever small ways he could. Let's talk about something uncomfortable. When we learn about the Holocaust, there's a tendency to think in categories: perpetrators, victims, bystanders, rescuers. Nice clean labels that help us organize the chaos of history. But Charles Coward doesn't fit neatly into any category. He wasn't Jewish, so he's not a victim in the traditional sense. He wasn't German, so he's not a perpetrator or even a bystander in the usual meaning. He wasn't a diplomat or industrialist who could save thousands with a signature. He was a prisoner himself. Limited resources, constant supervision, one wrong move from being shot. Yet he found ways to resist. Small ways, practical ways, unglamorous ways, bribing guards with chocolate, swapping clothes in ditches, writing coded letters. These aren't the dramatic rescues we see in movies. No guns blazing, no last-minute escapes, just persistent, risky, ordinary courage. And that's precisely what makes his story important, because most of us will never face a situation like the Holocaust. We'll never have to decide whether to risk our lives to save strangers from genocide. We hope we'll never face such a choice. But we will face smaller choices, situations where doing the right thing is inconvenient, where standing up requires risk, where staying silent is easier than speaking out. And Charles Coward's story reminds us that those choices matter, that individual actions, even small ones, can have enormous consequences. Here's something else worth considering. For 25 years after the war, Charles Coward lived a quiet life. He didn't write memoirs, didn't give lectures, didn't make himself into a public figure. He went to work, he came home, he supported his football club. It was others who made him famous. John Castle writing his biography, Hollywood making the movie, the BBC doing the television special. Coward participated, but he never sought attention. Multiple people who knew him described him as modest, uncomfortable with praise, someone who genuinely believed he'd just done his duty. This raises an interesting question about how we remember heroes. Do we remember them accurately, or do we remember the version that's more comfortable? The movie version of Charles Coward is charming, clever, always one step ahead of the bumbling Germans. It's entertaining. It's inspirational in a feel-good way. But the real Charles Coward was doing something far darker and more complex. He was navigating a system built on death, exploiting its weaknesses, playing a game where the stakes were human lives. There's nothing light-hearted about bribing an SS guard for a corpse. Nothing funny about putting someone in a ditch and hoping the guards don't look too closely. The real story is harder, messier, more morally complicated, and perhaps that's why we sometimes prefer the Hollywood version. It's easier to celebrate than to truly understand. Charles Coward died on December 21st, 1976. He was 71 years old. He took most of his secrets with him, the identities of the people he saved, the full details of his methods, the private moments of doubt and fear. We're left with questions we can never answer. What did that night in the barracks really feel like? Not the sanitized version he might have told in court. The actual experience of lying there, surrounded by dying men, knowing he'd chosen to be there. What did that do to him? How did he decide who to save? With limited resources, limited opportunities, he couldn't save everyone. So how did he choose? Did that decision haunt him afterward? Did he dream about the ones he couldn't help? When he returned to his ordinary life, working in a furniture factory, taking the bus, watching football matches, could he ever really leave Auschwitz behind, or did it follow him? Did he smell the smoke in his dreams? Did he hear the coughs in the night? We don't know. He didn't talk about these things. Maybe he couldn't. Maybe he chose not to. Maybe some experiences are too big to share, too private to explain to people who weren't there. What we know is this: Charles Coward saw the worst humanity can do. And instead of being paralyzed by it, instead of protecting himself, instead of doing the minimum required to survive, he found ways to resist, small ways, dangerous ways, ways that saved lives. Charles Coward's story doesn't exist in isolation. He was one of many people who resisted the Holocaust in various ways. Some hid Jewish families, some forged documents, some smuggled children to safety. Some, like Oskar Schindler, used business connections. Some, like Raoul Wallenberg, used diplomatic immunity. Each found their own method, their own way to fight back. What's remarkable is the diversity of these stories. No single type of person became a rescuer, rich and poor, educated and uneducated, deeply religious and entirely secular. conservative and liberal. They came from every background, every nationality, every walk of life. The common thread wasn't privilege or resources, it was decision. At some point, each person decided that doing nothing was unacceptable, that the risk to themselves was worth the possibility of saving others, that their own safety mattered less than another human being's survival. Psychologists have studied this, tried to identify common traits among Holocaust rescuers. What makes someone risk their life for strangers? The research suggests there's no single profile, no genetic marker for heroism, but there are patterns. Often, rescuers had been taught from a young age that all people have equal value, that you help those in need, regardless of cost. That compassion isn't optional. Charles Coward grew up working class in London, not particularly religious, not an intellectual or activist. Just a man who apparently believed, deep down, that you don't stand by while people are murdered. You do what you can, with what you have, where you are. It's tempting to think the Holocaust was unique, a singular event that could never happen again, that we've learned, that humanity has progressed, that never again means never again. But genocide didn't end in 1945. Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, Myanmar. The methods change, the victims change, the perpetrators change. But the fundamental dynamic remains. One group decides, another group doesn't deserve to live. Systems are built to carry out that decision efficiently. And most people, faced with that reality, find ways to not see it, not know about it, not be responsible for it. Which makes Charles Coward's story perpetually relevant, because he couldn't claim ignorance. He was there, he saw it, he knew, and he had every excuse to do nothing. He was a prisoner himself. He had no power. He could have died any day. But he acted anyway. That's the lesson that transcends time and place. You don't need authority to do something. You don't need resources to resist. You don't need permission to help. You just need to decide that you will. In our time, we face different challenges. Not genocide on the scale of the Holocaust, for most of us. But we face moments where courage is required, where standing up costs something, where doing the right thing is uncomfortable or risky or unpopular. Charles Coward's story asks us, what will you do when faced with injustice, when you see people suffering, when the easy choice is to look away? What will you do? You might not be able to save 400 people. You might not even be able to save one. But will you try? Let's return to that nickname, the Count of Auschwitz. It's almost whimsical. Sounds like the title of a Gothic novel, but it carries weight. In a place designed to strip people of humanity, to reduce them to numbers, to make them powerless and disposable, Charles Coward maintained his humanity. He kept his sense of right and wrong. He remembered that the prisoners weren't numbers. They were people. They had names. They had lives. They mattered. The Nazis wanted to create a system so efficient, so overwhelming, that resistance was impossible. They built Auschwitz to be unstoppable, a machine for murder that ran 24 hours a day, guards, fences, dogs, guns, gas chambers, crematoria, every detail calculated to prevent escape, to prevent resistance, to prevent hope. And Charles Coward, armed with nothing but chocolate and courage, found the cracks in that system. He exploited the guards' greed. He used bureaucratic procedures against themselves. He turned the camp's own mechanisms into tools for rescue. He proved that no system, no matter how brutal, is truly impenetrable if someone is determined enough to find its weaknesses. That's why he was the Count, not because he had power, but because he had something the Nazis couldn't break, a stubborn, relentless refusal to accept that nothing could be done. The people Charles Coward saved went on to live lives, Some had children. Those children had children. There are people alive today who exist because a British POW decided to bribe an SS guard with chocolate 70 years ago. They don't all know the story. Some families lost the details over generations. The secrecy that protected them at the time also obscured the history. But somewhere there are grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the people Coward saved. They go to work, they fall in love, they argue about politics, they watch football matches. They live utterly ordinary lives, completely unaware that their existence is a consequence of extraordinary courage. That's the real measure of Charles Coward's impact. Not the medals or the plaques or the film, the quiet multiplication of life. The ripple effects of his actions, spreading forward through time, creating futures that wouldn't have existed without him. We owe something to that. Not debt exactly. We didn't know Charles Coward, we weren't there, but we owe something to the principle he represented. The idea that individuals matter, that actions have consequences. That courage doesn't require superhuman abilities, just human determination. There's a final irony worth noting. Charles Coward spent his whole life with a name that suggested fear, Coward. It must have been a joke in school, a source of teasing. The kind of name that carries assumptions. And then he spent 5 years proving those assumptions completely, utterly, spectacularly wrong. 9 escape attempts, 7 prisons, 1 Iron Cross from the enemy, 1 night in Auschwitz. 400 lives saved, maybe fewer, maybe more, but definitely some. Testimony at Nuremberg that helped convict war criminals. His last name became ironic, then symbolic, then almost perfect. Because it reminds us that courage isn't about having a brave name or a military title or special training. Courage is about choosing to act when action is difficult. About deciding that your fear matters less than someone else's life. Charles Coward was afraid. Of course he was. You'd have to be insane not to be afraid in Auschwitz. Afraid of being caught, afraid of being shot, afraid of torture, afraid of dying far from home. The fear was rational and justified. But he acted anyway. That's what courage actually looks like. Not the absence of fear, not some genetic immunity to danger, just the decision that fear won't be the deciding factor. That something else matters more. December 1943, a cold night in occupied Poland. A British prisoner of war stands at an invisible line between two worlds. On one side, relative safety, a warm barracks, food, the hope of surviving until liberation. On the other side, hell, starvation, disease, death. Charles Coward steps across that line, voluntarily, into the condemned section of Auschwitz to witness what the world needs to know, to see with his own eyes what's being done to human beings, to carry that testimony forward so that justice might eventually be served. That's one night, one decision, one moment in a war filled with millions of moments. But multiply that night by 5 years, by hundreds of small decisions, by each piece of chocolate used as a bribe, by each body swapped in a ditch, by each coded letter sent to Mr. Orange, by each risk taken, each guard evaded, each life saved. Add them together and you get a portrait of resistance. Not the Hollywood version with guns and explosions and dramatic music. The real version, mundane, practical, unglamorous, exhausting, dangerous, effective. Charles Coward didn't save everyone. He couldn't. The machinery of genocide was too vast, too efficient, too overwhelming. 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, millions of others. Roma, political prisoners, disabled people, gay men, Soviet POWs. The numbers are incomprehensible. But Charles Coward saved some. And for those people, for their families, for their descendants, that difference is everything. The difference between existence and erasure, between life and death, between being remembered and being forgotten. He returned to England after the war, to his quiet life, his furniture factory, his football matches, his local pub. He didn't seek fame, didn't write memoirs proclaiming his heroism, didn't tour the country giving speeches about courage. He just lived quietly, with his memories, with his secrets, with whatever burdens he carried from those years. In 1976, Charles Coward died at 71. He was buried in London. His funeral was attended by family, friends, fellow veterans. A modest affair for a modest man. The kind of funeral thousands of people have every year. Quiet, dignified, soon forgotten by anyone not directly involved. But his name remains, at Yad Vashem, inscribed on the Wall of Honor, on the blue plaque at 133 Chichester Road in Edmonton, in the ward named after him at North Middlesex Hospital, in the archives at Nuremberg, where his testimony is preserved for anyone who wants to read it, in the book that's still in print after 70 years. In this story, being told again, passed forward to another generation, the Count of Auschwitz, the man who broke in, the British POW who wouldn't stop fighting even when he was captured, the soldier whose name meant coward but whose actions defined courage. History is filled with extraordinary people doing extraordinary things, leaders making grand decisions, generals winning battles, inventors changing the world. We remember them because their impact is obvious, visible, undeniable. But history is also filled with ordinary people making extraordinary choices, small decisions that ripple forward in ways they never see, quiet acts of defiance that add up to something larger, individual moments of courage that, multiplied across millions of people, change the world. Charles Coward was one of those people, a furniture factory worker from London, a man who loved football and hated injustice, a soldier who refused to accept that being captured meant the war was over, a prisoner who saw the Holocaust happening and decided that chocolate, cleverness, and determination were enough to fight back. Was he perfect? Probably not. Did he save everyone? No. Did he exaggerate some of his exploits? Maybe. Historians debate the details. They question the numbers. They search for corroboration. But the core truth remains undeniable. Charles Coward was at Auschwitz. He witnessed genocide. He testified about it at Nuremberg. He saved lives. However many, it was more than zero. And in the darkness of the Holocaust, in the face of industrial murder, even one life saved is a victory. We tell his story not to create a saint, not to ignore the questions or the gaps in the historical record. We tell his story because it reminds us of something essential about human nature, that we always have choices. Even in the worst circumstances, even when every rational calculation says there's nothing to be done, we can choose to look away. Or we can choose to see. We can choose to protect ourselves. Or we can choose to take risks for others. We can choose to do the minimum required to survive. Or we can choose to resist in whatever ways we can. Charles Coward made his choice. 9 times he chose to escape. Every time he was caught, he chose to try again. When he arrived at Auschwitz, he chose to document what he saw. He chose to share his Red Cross packages. He chose to bribe guards. He chose to spend a night in hell when he could have stayed safe. He chose to save people he'd never met and would never see again. Those choices define him, not his name, not his rank, not the controversies about exact numbers or specific details. His choices, the accumulated weight of decisions made under impossible circumstances. The stubborn refusal to accept that nothing could be done. In the end, that's what the Count of Auschwitz really means. Not that Charles Coward ruled anything, but that in a place designed to make people powerless, he found power. In a system built to make resistance impossible, he found ways to resist. In the heart of darkness, he carried a light. It was a small light, just one man, just chocolate and paperwork and midnight swaps in ditches. But in Auschwitz, even the smallest light mattered. Even the smallest acts of humanity pushed back against the vast machinery of death. Charles Coward's light went out in 1976, but the lives he saved continued. The testimony he gave remained. The example he set endured. And now, decades later, we're still talking about him. Still trying to understand how an ordinary man did extraordinary things. Maybe that's the final lesson, that there are no ordinary people. Only ordinary circumstances that reveal what we're capable of. Charles Coward wasn't born a hero, he became one. Through choices, through actions, through the stubborn, repeated decision to do what was right even when it was dangerous. We can't all be Charles Coward. We probably won't face the choices he faced. We probably won't have opportunities to save hundreds of lives from genocide. But we'll face our own choices, our own moments where courage is required, our own chances to do something, even if it's small, even if it's risky, even if it costs us something. When those moments come, remember the Count of Auschwitz. Remember the furniture maker from London who decided that chocolate could be a weapon. That one person could make a difference. That courage doesn't require a fearless name, just determined action. Remember Charles Coward, the man whose name suggested weakness, but whose life proved that strength comes from what we do, not what we're called. The prisoner who never stopped fighting, the witness who told the truth, the rescuer who saved what lives he could. Remember him, honor him, learn from him. And when your moment comes, when you face your choice between safety and courage, between looking away and seeing, between doing nothing and doing something, ask yourself, what would the Count of Auschwitz do? Then do that. Charles Joseph Coward, born January 30th, 1905, died December 21st, 1976. British soldier. Prisoner of war, witness, rescuer. Righteous, among the nations. A man with a coward's name and a hero's heart. A quiet life bookended by extraordinary years. An ordinary person who proved that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they decide that doing nothing isn't acceptable. His story deserves to be remembered, not just for what he did, but for what he represents. The power of individual action, the necessity of moral courage, the difference one person can make when they refuse to accept that evil is unstoppable. The Count of Auschwitz, the man who broke in, the hero who called himself nothing special. Charles Coward, remember the name, remember the story, remember the lesson. Because the world still needs people like him. It always will.